Thank you. Welcome to the September 13th Policy Committee meeting for the Wallingford-Swarthmore School District. We apologize for the late start, but we're back to school night. Parking was at a premium, so we are all finally here and ready to start the evening. So I'd like to start with roll call. Ms. Holbert. Present. Ms. Whitsett. Here. Ms. Delay. And Ms. Walkman. Okay. Very good. First, we need a motion to approve the minutes from the August 9th meeting. We'd like to make that motion. I'm sorry. Okay. And Ms. Whitsett. Thank you. All those in favor of approving those minutes? Aye. Thank you. We'll move on to start the evening with presentation and discussion of policies and accompanying administrative regulations, all for first readings. We'll start with policy 008 organizational charts, which was last revised in 2020.
All right, so the organizational chart, would you want to share? So the organizational chart, when this comes up, will now be moved to an administrative regulation, and the policy language simply directs that the superintendent or designee create and update an organizational chart. And the policy language was written to basically say that in the future, if there are changes in titles or if additional positions are approved by the board, the superintendent has the authority to modify the organizational chart consistent with the board's action without any further board action. So in other words, if the board were to vote at a public meeting to approve a new administrator, the organizational chart would simply be updated without any further action of the board. Or if titles change and that's been approved by the board, the organizational chart not necessarily come back before this committee because the board approved that position and the reporting structure in the board action to hire that person.
Questions?
I had a quick question that I had. Was just out of curiosity from the organizational chart itself. The director of athletics and activities part of that administrative structure.
It will be.
It will be.
And that will not be shortly.
Right. Okay. Okay. Because that was the one that just kind of stood out to me. Feeling.
Yes.
Yes.
Any other questions about that one?
Anybody? Comments? No?
Okay, we'll move on to policy 903. A number of the policies that we're looking at this evening relate to public participation in school district affairs, whether that be attending a school event, attending a board meeting, speaking at a board meeting, participating on various committees. That's the theme of tonight's policies that we're taking a look at. So next we'll move to 903, which is public participation in board meetings. This is the policy that sort of governs public comment. It tracks the Sunshine Act. And some of the changes the committee may recall a year or so ago, Pennsbury school district's public comment procedures were challenged in court. And as a result of those, as a result of that litigation, the court gave some guidance on what public comment should look like, mainly around what what speech could be prohibited during public comment. And so the template of 903 has been updated to reflect some of the guidance that the court gave us in that decision involving Pensbury.
So can I ask a question on that? Under, like, when it gets to the legal section at the bottom, is the court, how is that reflected there? Like that you had to update for a court decision? Not, do those letters and numbers mean something related to a court decision?
So those letters and numbers are references to the Sunshine Act and the school code provisions around public comment. So we don't necessarily cite cases, but we certainly, as cases interpret the law, which is cited, we update the policies accordingly.
Okay, all right, they're just not, like, we couldn't find that there was a direct, that as a direct result of this court case, this was updated.
Correct. And many times when cases are decided, they may or may not have a binding effect on every other school district, depending on the posture of the case.
Right.
But you can learn themes from a decision, or you can read into a decision what the court was doing, and you could assume that a similar court in a different county, for example, may do something similar. So it gives you a good sense as to how the law would be interpreted, and we update the policy accordingly.
Can I ask another question to that then? I'm sorry, no, we'll go on. Does this legal section ever refer to federal law when applicable?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah,
so it's not just state.
correct.
Right. Anybody have any questions about 903?
So the situation that I'm rethinking involved public comment recently, where the matter came at the right time in the agenda. It wasn't an action item for action on the agenda, so it was offered at the proper time. But it was essentially it was raising the concern about the work that had to be done on the fields, whatever that was.
The field,
Yeah. And that isn't a matter that would come before the board, I don't think. And one could have responded saying that's actually not a matter that would come before the board for decision by the board.
So public comment is for matters that are before the board or could come before the board. So problems with the fields could be a board. That it is a matter that, maintaining the fields is a function of the board.
Okay.
Maintaining facilities, that is a function of ultimately the board. So
Okay.
that would be a
All
proper.
right. All right.
proper-
I was thinking about it too narrowly, because I was thinking about it in the terms of it's a matter of when a contractor is available to come and do the work, over which we're not going to really be able to exercise anything other than ask them. But that's too narrow a view of that. Okay, all right, very good. That's all I was trying to parse out.
I think these are fairly, I'm just gonna ask every time because I don't want to go. If you had a question about 903 and we were already at the end, let's just take care of it right now. Okay,
I have a question if I may,
great.
before we go. Page 2, item number 5, indicates that, sentence starts with, well, the second sentence. This may include during the total time permitted for the board participation, limiting the time allocated to each speaker or adjourning the meeting without a final public comment period. Is that language redacted, or is that new language, or do I have an old version?
That's new language.
Okay, so if it's new language, then, how does it impact the policy which indicates that there are two moments in which the board can speak, the public can speak. So the board can adjourn the meeting and not have a second public comment period?
As long as public comment is offered at a future meeting before the board takes action. So before the board takes formal action on any item, there has to be an opportunity for public comment. Let's say at the end of the meeting or towards the end of the meeting, there's a public comment, discussion, and folks are commenting about, I'll make something up, a proposed change to the school calendar. And let's say that that proposed change is not going to be voted on by the board until next month's meeting. The board could say, we've had 90 minutes of public comment. It's getting late in the evening. We're going to adjourn this meeting. We're not going to take any more public comment. We're not taking any action tonight on the proposed calendar change. We'll be considering a calendar change at our next meeting. And before we take that action, there will be a further opportunity to comment. That's entirely acceptable because there's another opportunity to comment before the board takes action.
Okay, so each and every single time the board decides not to have a second comment period, then they're not voting on any of the items.
Correct. It wouldn't vote on anything. Well,
Second one. is
so
always
when
on
is the first public
Well,
comment section?
First public comment is on voting items.
Yeah.
The board. Parent, guardian, community member realizes, hey, I didn't know this was on the agenda. I get into my vehicle. I drive to the board meeting. Because I want to comment on what was just on the agenda.
On something that was already voted on?
No, it hasn't, it's on the agenda, right? There was a public comment period.
Yeah.
Right after Ms. Walkman does her thing and that's it.
Yep.
I don't get to that public comment period, right?
Now
The board-
now the meeting has.
Now the meeting begins, the board votes on something, I get into my car and I drive. Or it doesn't happen yet. When I get to the board meeting, and the board decides to then cancel that second public comment meeting, am I denied the opportunity to object?
No, because there was an opportunity to comment. You weren't there, but
But the board said there's two periods though. So arbitrarily, we just canceled the second.
isn't
Yeah.
the second public comment at the very end of the meeting?
Yes, it is.
After all the voting has taken place?
Well, is it true that the board can come back and say, we'd like to reconvene an item that was just voted on?
No, once you vote, you voted.
So a board member can come back after they thoughtfully deliberated after voting on section 11. Now we're on section 17. And before the gavel hits, they're like, you know what? I'd like to do a motion to open up A, B, C, or D.
Not, generally not.
Okay. I'm playing worst case scenario for individuals who believe we did not access an opportunity. And as soon as someone sees, oh, the board has the authority to not have a second public comment, they might see that as a way in which the board is now allowing their voices to be heard. So I just want to make sure that I don't see it that way, but I'm sure there are someone
Sure.
out there who may see it that way. So I just want to be clear about what opportunity exists for that individual.
A second public comment period is never required by the law.
Okay,
What's required is before the board takes
Got it.
action, there has to be a period of comment.
okay.
Many times what districts do, right, and it's probably what's happening here, the first public comment section, we say, we're just gonna reserve this for voting items. So that folks who wanna speak, but don't wanna have to, wait for the whole meeting to take place to speak, can speak at the beginning on the agenda. Then you allow the board to do the business of the board, and then at the end, those things that weren't on the agenda, but for example, to Mrs. Swanman's point, things that may come before the board, or folks just want to raise concerns or comments, that's what the second public comment period is for. But if the board, if the hour gets late and that second public comment period has to go away. As long as you have another opportunity to comment for future action items, you're okay.
Got it. Thank you.
Well, that takes care of my question.
We have a community member with their hand raised.
Does that mean that they don't have to have? When they have that next meeting and there's that open, doesn't necessarily have to be on the items for agenda?
At the second comment period.
Yes,
at
the
the next
second comment period went away,
Yep,
but you're saying they have to be able to have the opportunity to do it before there's action. But the item isn't necessarily
on the next agenda.
on the next agenda?
So you could do it you could have that comment heard at the second comment period at the next meeting.
So at the same time
The
that
same
would
day.
have been at the first meeting, it would still be a second comment.
If it's never on the agenda,
Right, then.
and you always end up getting rid of the second one, did they ever get hurt?
Well, the public comment portion of the meeting is really the entitlement to be heard is on things before the board votes at a public meeting. But that doesn't mean that there's not other ways to contact the board, right? So Pennsylvania law requires that email addresses for school board members be posted on the website. You can email. And there's generally always an opportunity to speak at that second comment period. Every once in a while, though, it gets cut short, maybe because the meeting ran very long or something like that. But I can't envision a scenario where every month after month after month, the board would just keep canceling the second comment period, right?
Taking it to an extreme, but
Correct.
we will not be doing. All right,
All right, so we'll move on to 904. 904 is titled Public Attendance at School Events. This policy essentially outlines some rules that the public's expected to follow when on school property. This is the policy that applies to community members that states that, tobacco is not permitted, alcohol is not permitted, weapons are not permitted, those types of things. There's obviously student-related policies and staff-related policies that say those things. This is the policy in the community section that announces those rules.
okay, I did have a question that I'll bring up. I brought it up earlier about bringing it up here. This policy brings up the Silver Panthers application. And I'm wondering if the AR needs to do something about that, have something related to the Silver Panthers application. Or is this enough? I'm just wondering if that's kind of like a place where we need to fill in.
If there's an application form, the application form could be attached to a regulation, sort of similar to what we did with the organizational chart policy. I can work with administration offline to get a copy of that application, and we would just amend the policy to say something like, so right now it says any resident who's 65 or older, they become a member by applying in the office of the superintendent. We would just add language that says, this application form is also available in the accompanying administrative regulation. And then we would have an administrative regulation that would say, see attached to the form for Silver Panthers. That would
This
be-
really is at the office of the superintendent. This is where where somebody who's 65 or older needs to go to your Debbie or something. I'm just curious.
Everything's the office of the superintendent.
Oh, okay. I didn't know, like I was
I didn't
thinking.
know either, so like me. When in doubt, everyone will go to the office of the superintendent.
Fair enough. See, I did.
And one of my questions later, after we open up the questions.
And we're gonna check because we're not even sure that there is a formal application process. It may simply be that at the event, if you show that you're 65 or older,
Mhm.
we'll check on that.
Okay,
I don't.
yeah, I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
So,
Yeah, let's get
so
that down a
should
little
it-
bit closer.
should it say, or in the AR, should it say that PA ID needs to be available, like you either have to have from your state rep, they give you a senior card or your driver's license. So that's what you show at the event.
We'll look and see if there is an application right now, what that asks for. My guess is it simply asks for verification of address and age, which would be your driver's license. Or non-driver's license.
So I give them free.
So, but you have to have the Panther card to do that. You don't want people standing at the gate checking everybody's license. We want you to get the silver card from us and then you just show them your silver card.
That's the, yeah, that's the,
Yeah, so
you have to go to the superintendent's office to get that silver card. Who has those coveted silver cards? I need to know it.
Ms. Elias has the keys. All those.
All right. Any other questions about 904? Anybody? Going once? Okay. Oh, wait, yes.
Yes, I had a question. Two questions. The first one, page 2 of 3 under authority. The board has looked at, give me 1 second. Yes, it says here, the board versus gambling, and so forth. Is 50-50 considered gambling? And if so, we've been doing a lot of it.
So there's rules on 50/50s. They fall under the Small Games of Chance Act.
Okay,
So whether or not a 50/50 is permitted is on a municipality by municipality basis through the state. So let's talk offline.
so I don't know if our municipality actually states that we are authorized to run 50/50.
So we'll check on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Under service animals,
Check this out. Okay.
it says that individuals with disabilities may be accompanied by their service animals fly out on district property for events, but what if it's just a therapy companion dog, like how veterans have it, so they don't wear the vest to identify them, it could be a cat. But
So,
it keeps them from
so we,
anxiety.
Is there a definition?
we probably have, we have a policy on service animals, and that service animals probably says that therapy dogs or therapy animals do not fall within the definition of service dogs, talking about strictly service dogs.
But are you more concerned is what's said about approaching that individual because they don't have what normally
Yes,
that service animal has some type of identification?
yes, that's what I'm asking is, as we bring this policy up to the board, is it going to that now we have therapy support dogs and they're legit,
And they're not. So, you
they're
know,
trained.
so our service animals policy says that the provision of emotional support, well-being, comfort, and companionship, that's a therapy animal, does not constitute work or tasks that a service animal would perform. So therapy animals are not considered service animals as that term is used in 904.
But who determined that? Is that a state thing
Uh,
or is that a school thing?
These are the ADA regulations. And let's see if I can. So when we're talking about service animals, the ADA regulations specifically say that tasks such as emotional support, well-being, comfort, companionship are separate and apart from service animal functions. Now, it would be a different question to say, could the board say you can allow animals onto our property that are not service animals? There's no law that prohibits you from saying that. Most school districts aim to comply with the ADA language and would not open it up because it gets a little bit hard to manage and to police if you open it up more. But if your question to me is, if we as a board wanted to have a policy that said you can bring animals onto our property, I wouldn't be able to point to a rule or a law that would say you can't. The board could do it if it wanted to. I don't know of any school district that does that, but you could.
One last question for me, if I can.
Yep.
Delegation of responsibility, the superintendent or designee shall ensure that the policy is posted on district's publicly accessible website. That is anywhere on our website.
Correct.
Board doc is considered.
Yes.
Oh, you do?
There are, and I might be able to pull it up here. There are a number of policies that are required by the school code specifically to be posted. Admission of students, student discipline. But there are some policies that are not specifically called out in this list, and therefore there's no legal requirement that they be posted. That said, when we do have a policy that is specifically required by the school code to be posted, we generally add that language to our policy. We know that it's probably not necessary because all of our policies are always online, but since it's a specific legal requirement, we build it into this policy. But it counts as being on board docs.
And Ms. Silver, that's a perfect example of federal law guiding the decisions. So ADA is federal, it's not state.
Right.
Correct. Policy 905 is titled Citizen Advisory Committees. This is a policy, some districts have this policy, some have repealed it. With or without this policy, the board can always, task a committee with a certain task or can create a committee. The board can always do that. This policy is a discretionary policy, meaning that the board is not required as a result of this policy to create any citizen advisory committees. However, if it does, this policy gives guidelines on how members should be selected and how those committees should generally be run.
I didn't have anything on this one, other than that, something I pointed out to you offline.
I didn't have any questions. I do think it's one I would prefer to have, because we have had advisory committees in the past and it was ambiguous at best at the time when we chose to not have it anymore, and then people start asking questions. So, and they ask questions about why was this one selected and not that one, and blah, 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 blah.
Is there any particular reason why it's called a citizen advisory committee? Is that to reflect community members? because the boards have always had the discretion to organize and create and call for an advisory committee to help explore a topic, help investigate a topic with administration and or the board. Is that what the state or PSBA recommends as the standard?
These committees are usually not committees of board members. Sometimes there's a board member or an administrator liaison to the board, but they're generally groups of citizens or community members that come together and are charged with researching a topic. One that comes to mind, 10 years or so ago, after the economic downturn, many school districts were looking for ways to cut costs. And they would task a group of, financially inclined community members who would volunteer that would say, we're gonna put together a report of things where we think the board could save money. And they're a citizen committee. They may be given a liaison, maybe to the business manager. A board member may even sit on that committee, but it's generally a committee of community members.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
So it's not, if I can use another example, so in a previous district, when there was conversation around homework. And what does that mean? What does that look like K through 12? The board tasked administration to develop an advisory committee made up of community members, educators, to review and present to the board a recommendation for homework for elementary, middle, and high school students. Is it something like that?
That's probably less of a citizen advisory committee because it's mainly school officials that sit on that committee, right? Administrators, teachers.
Yes.
Maybe there's a parent representative or a community member
Yes, yes, yes.
representative. These citizen committees are generally primarily comprised
Of citizens? Got it.
They're very infrequent.
So it's like when, the issue of the busing and redesigning the maps, and we had groups of people that came all with the same, they were all from the same neighborhood with the exact
Right.
same presentation, like, is that considered?
No. Let me think of another example. Another example could be, the district is thinking that it wants to be more environmentally sustainable and wants to figure out a way to reduce plastic consumption in schools. Maybe the board members don't have particularized expertise in how to do that, but maybe the townships and boroughs that make up the school district have environmental advisory committees, or they have just community members that are well-versed on that topic. They may ask a group of 6 citizens to put their heads together and present a report to the board of recommendations they might have about how the district could reduce plastic consumption. It would be the board tasking a group of citizens to do whatever the board would ask it to do, generally to give guidance or recommendations on a particular topic.
The township does actually a fair amount, and
Yeah.
GAC is one of the,
Yeah.
that's done that way. Yeah.
All right, so we can move on to 906. 906 is the public complaints policy. And really the policy just sets out the fact that how anonymous complaints will get handled, the general framework under which complaints will be investigated. There's a non-retaliation provision built into the policy. The real details of the policy are in the regulation. And there's a step-by-step process on that complaints should be submitted through. And it's basically a chain of command based process. So, you first start with the individual that's, most directly. You start with the individual who the complaint relates to. If those folks can't resolve the matter, then it would get elevated to the second level, which is generally a building principal or a supervisor. Third level, if it doesn't get resolved there, it would come to the central office. And fourth, if the matter is not a matter that the superintendent, has authority over, it could be a matter that the board could be referred to the board. So it's just a step-by-step basis of processing complaints by individuals who wish to do so. There's a special complaint procedure here for federal programs. We're required by law to have a complaint procedure for complaints around how federal money is spent. And this is a very generic process that the federal programs auditors have reviewed and signed off on as an acceptable process.
I didn't think that this one. And that one. Back to my zone. Anything else, anybody else? All right, that was pretty straightforward, thank
Yeah.
you.
And then the last one is 919, is the civility policy. I recommended that we put civility back on this agenda because policy 906 references the civility policy and encourages folks when they make complaints to do so in a way that's consistent with the civility policy. This would be a new first reading before the board. So if this committee wanted to make comments on this policy, you could choose to move it forward to another first reading and try again, or we could just leave it here. But it did go nicely with policy 906. I think I heard that the concern that existed at the board level with 919 previously was that the board wanted to make sure that this policy wasn't going to prohibit community members outside of a board meeting from essentially speaking their mind, right, to board members. And this policy outside of a board meeting, individual school board members are free to engage with or not engage with community members however they see fit. So regardless of what the school district's policy is, if you're in the grocery store on a weekend and someone comes up to you and says, I'd like to speak to you about this instructional issue, regardless of what your policy says, you're free to speak to that person or not speak to that person, whether they're nice or not. The civility policy applies when the board is operating as a board at a meeting. And we actually say in here that this policy doesn't necessarily apply, or it doesn't apply to the public comment portions of meetings, which is the official time when community members can speak to the board, because as we learned about earlier, the courts have imposed certain requirements that people don't have to be nice to you in public comment, right? They can disagree with you. They can have their opinions on actions that you've taken. And you can't, at the public comment section of a meeting, say, I don't like what you're saying to me, so I'm not going to talk to you because you're not being civil, right? But when you're not in the board meeting at the public comment portion of the meeting, that's discretionary on the part of any board member. So what I would say is I don't think that this policy is not designed to limit anyone's First Amendment rights to speak to the board.
Okay. I engaged in a conversation about this earlier today, and I hadn't, I didn't have it in front of me at the time.
Sure.
Does this policy pertains, kind of a double question here. This policy pertains to everybody while we're like on school grounds or at like a school sponsored event in another place, like, so I have a bunch of questions related to this. This relates, I thought this didn't relate to students, but it does. I thought that student behavior was kind of like in a different place. Is that? And I think I was wrong because I see right here, it says it pertains to students. Is that correct?
We list students because, for example, I'll give you an example. We get this every year. A parent will be accused of yelling at another, at a child, not their own, at the bus stop,
Yeah.
right? And we would say to the parent, that's a violation of our civility policy because students are included, right? When students don't act in a civil manner, we look at that, to your point, as a violation of the student discipline code. And we wouldn't invoke our civility policy, but students are protected under this policy from the lack of civility by, volunteers, members of the public, even employees. Now, if an
Yeah.
employee was acting in a way that was not civil towards an employee or towards a student, again, there's policies in the HR section that apply.
Okay, that's
So
what I
this,
had
this
said.
really applies
Yeah.
when there's no other policy that speaks to a different process.
Okay, that's what I had thought. And just to follow up on that other process with students. The student like code of conduct or whatever that's also called. Does that applies to like, we expect our students to maintain a certain code of conduct when they're at other schools? Like at a official school function. That's what I thought. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't like. If our kids go to
Our expectation
Ridley,
follow you.
yes, so it's not like Ridley's rules take over at Ridley and, we don't, right, okay, just wanted to, okay.
As long as you have on the colors and you represent Wallingford-Swarthmore School District, then you must be civil wherever you are.
If you're under
Okay.
the jurisdiction, if you're doing that on a Saturday morning in your backyard, not
No,
necessarily.
no. But I mean, if
If
you're
you're in an
running
official
the
school
car
function.
wash
Right,
and you
right.
have on T-shirts
Yep.
and
If you don't,
and someone comes up and they're rude to you and the student snaps back. Are they still protected?
So that would be a student, it could potentially be a student discipline code violation. We probably would not invoke the civility policy, but school rules apply in school, on school district property, at all school-sponsored events, whether they're here or away, and during the time traveling to and from those events. So anytime you're engaging in a school-related activity, the student discipline code of conduct applies. Same is true with staff as well.
that answered the question to my extent.
So we'll finally get this thing off the first read.
Maybe.
Maybe, that's right.
Please, Lord, Jesus.
Kelly?
No, I'm comfortable, I think.
Thank you.
We'll hear other feedback again, I'm sure, but I'm comfortable right now.
And if there is other feedback, like if any individual board members have questions, I'm happy to speak to them before the board meeting, so that you don't get to the board meeting and not know the answer and then get tabled again. I'd rather address the questions in advance, so
Yeah.
encourage anyone who may
I
have
will.
questions.
I will,
reach out.
yeah, 'cause I did reach out to the person with the question
Yeah.
about the board conduct as related to this too.
Sure.
Any questions? No?
What was it? I don't want to speak for someone, but what was the issue that Dr. Grande had?
That was the one that he addressed earlier. That was his question about to what degree it regulates our conduct, the board specifically. As a matter of fact,
The concern was potentially the board evoking that policy as a result of engagement with a community member outside the scope of a board meeting. All of a sudden, someone approaches you in the supermarket, they're engaged in conversation, and you invoke your civility policy and attempt to stop them from engaging in that level of discourse. Am I correct, Mr. Diazio, in terms of, we just want to be mindful, or let the community know that that did not extend to that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right, we said, my primary concern is that it not be interpreted as impacting public opportunity to communicate with the board
yes.
or how board members deliberate on issues.
You know, the individuals who you're with your family on a weekend and they say, oh, I know you have your family, but they don't take a second. Yeah. You can't invoke the civility policy. You can say, I'm with my family, it's all hours, and I contact you another time.
It's all right.
The fact that I'm more than Cheyenne's and you know.
Anything from anybody else for the good of the group? This was really fast.
We didn't have any of the second readings on here because they haven't yet gone for first reading, so we'll have, that's why it's shorter. We only have to do that.
All right.
We'll keep the agenda a little bit shorter next month.
I mean, I can make, town teacher. I can,
Yeah.
Is it over?
is it over? I hope not.
No, it goes till 9. All right, let's close up.
I don't know, any other public comments?
What? I'll go.
Our next meeting is October 11th, at 7 p.m. in this room, B226 is the middle school. We look forward to seeing anyone who would like to join us, and with that, we will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.